Alina Bricman is joining us today from our office in Brussels, which focuses on European Union affairs. Alina, thank you for joining us.
Hi, Dan. It's good to be with you. Thank you for having me.
So the first question, it relates to Iran, which, of course, all of us are concerned about. And there are certain perspectives that come out of Europe, and I'd be interested in your take. Are we seeing any shifts within the EU towards Iran at a time when the regime is cracking down more violently on its own people, and when we've learned that Iran is selling thousands of drones, attack drones, to the Russians for the war in Ukraine? What are you seeing?
Right. Well, it's often those unexpected and sudden events that tend to change the course of history. And the death of Mahsa Amini in September, or Gina Amini, as is her Kurdish name, certainly, I think, can be viewed as one such moment. The slogan, "Woman, Life, Freedom," is now being heard around the world. And the revolt of women in Iran, of young people in Iran, is really hard to ignore. Of course, there have been crackdowns in the past, but this particular moment really seems to have struck a chord with the public around the world, and that certainly includes Europe. Now, how is this affecting Europe's attitude to Iran on a political level and with regard to the nuclear deal in particular, perhaps? Well, ever since 2006, when the talks of the deal were just starting, the EU was always sort of the eager actor. And that attitude consistently lent itself to kowtowing to further requests from Tehran, and the sort of willingness to deal very lightly with signs of non-compliance once the deal was actually signed. Now, at the time of Amini's death in September, negotiations for a new deal and the re-entry into agreement between the US and Iran were already in quite a bit of a stalemate. This following more than a year of negotiations since the Biden administration entered into office. An investigation into uranium traces was found at a number of undeclared nuclear facilities in Iran. Iran was calling for the end to these probes. Now we must keep in mind that all this while, Iran has only been continuing to advance and to accelerate its nuclear power far beyond the scope that had been laid out back in 2015. So you have this investigation into the uranium traces. You have a series of other points of contention, the listing of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps as a terrorist organization. You add to this the really massive ongoing human rights protests in Iran. And finally, you see the European Union beginning to firm up its position a little bit. And in addition to this, you see, as you noted, Iranian drones making their way to Russia and being used by Russia in the war against Ukraine, including against civilians. To this, the French Foreign Ministry, for instance, noted that drones targeting civilians likely constitute war crimes, and that Iran was in violation of the UN Security Council Resolution 2231. This is a resolution under which Iran is prohibited from exporting missile systems or drones that are actually capable of delivering weapons of mass destruction. So between the European public support towards the women of Iran and the support towards Ukraine, the political will of European leaders to engage with Iran is sort of finally scaling back. Talks for Europe to list the IRGC as a terror organization have actually been increasing. This with a push from the Green German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock. And in fact, it is noteworthy that the Green Party in the German parliament has actually voted to list the organization as a terror group. So Europe seems to somewhat have woken up to the fact that the theocratic leadership in Tehran is not a viable partner for negotiations, and there doesn't seem to be a current path to move forward. But I will say this doesn't mean that talks won't resume, and I don't want to make too much of a prediction, but I hope that at least through these series of episodes, Europe will have a much clearer understanding of the threat that Iran poses as a regime and the nature of Iran as a negotiating partner.
Well, we hope the street demonstrations and the drone sales are permanent wake-up calls for Europe, because for Iran to get a strong message internationally, there needs to be more than just a consensus. There needs to be the will to isolate and push back against the Iranians. So we'll watch it very closely. I want to talk about anti-Semitism now. Anti-Semitism has always been an issue in Europe, sometimes in the West, sometimes in the center, sometimes in the East, sometimes all the way across the continent. And I'm talking in contemporary times. Are we seeing right now anti-Semitism is worryingly on the rise in some European countries? There are perhaps, though, a couple of noteworthy positive developments. We should talk about that. What are some of the hopeful and more promising points that we should be looking at?
Yes, absolutely. And perhaps maybe first linking to our initial question, one thing that seemingly has not factored into European leaders' negotiation with Iran has been the virulent anti-Semitism and the genocidal rhetoric directed at Israel coming out of Tehran. And as you say, anti-Semitism in numerous variations has been a consistent challenge. A number of far-right parties have gained great traction across Europe. This has emboldened a lot of hate in what would otherwise be the far corners of society. We've seen challenges to religious freedom. We've seen Israel-related anti-Semitism. These are very real and persistent, and at times indeed growing challenges. But as a very devoted European, I've never seen Europe as an uninhabitable place for Jews. On the contrary, I think a thriving Jewish life where contributions of Jewish Europeans, of Jewish culture, of Jewish heritage to the European fabric is the thing that we strive to protect in our work here with the European institutions and with European governments. And maybe in a way that seems trivial, of course, that is what our work is. But if we're thinking of Europe solely as a place that is threatening, that is not safe to Jews, I think we're less likely to invest and contribute to that positive element of Jewish life. So I think it's really important to acknowledge those positive contributions, and I appreciate you making this part of the discussion. The president of the European Commission, the German Ursula von der Leyen, gave her first address to a Jewish organization, to B'nai B'rith International, in 2021. She said, B'nai B'rith had never wavered in our mission to fight anti-Semitism, to promote Jewish life and stand by Israel, and to preserve the memory of the Holocaust. And she said that she is there to tell all Europeans that Europe is along in this endeavor, because anti-Semitism strikes at the heart of our European values of humanity, religious freedom, and equality. She noted anti-Semitism is a poison for our society, and that it is up to all of us to fight it, to prevent it, and to eradicate it. So that political will, right at the top of the European executive body, I think is hugely important in and of itself. Many of those watching might be familiar with the European Commission's coordinator for combating anti-Semitism and fostering Jewish life, Katharina von Schnurbein. She's been an outstanding ally who has really spearheaded the efforts to scale up this fight across Europe. And under her leadership, a few essential points of progress have been achieved. I'll note at the top of that list the recent first ever EU strategy to address anti-Semitism. which is essentially a roadmap with clear commitments, both for the European Union, but also with recommendations for the 27 countries of the EU. We at B'nai B'rith have contributed significantly to the recommendations, and we're happy that a large part of them were taken up. Many European countries have appointed national coordinators. Many European governments, in fact, a majority, have adopted the IRA definition of anti-Semitism. Many national governments have published national action plans to address anti-Jewish hatred. Members of the European Union have all committed to do so by the end of this year, by the end of 2022. Just the other day, the German National Action Plan was published. Others have already been in place for a year or more, and that's a great step forward. A significant amount of funding for civil society has been made available by the European Commission. And all these points can seem quite bureaucratic. If it seems so to you, you're certainly right. But the creation of these structures and the publication of these tools is really the absolutely necessary fertile ground on which to provide the work of implementation and on which to actually base future action. And I think this work is really beginning to be felt. There was a major civil society forum organized by the European Commission the last month, a summit on religious freedom with an eye to safeguard ritual slaughter took place. There is a growing, I think, transatlantic partnership between the European coordinator and the American Special Envoy, Deborah Lipstadt, that I think will really create a space to share best practices, and I think that will be quite constructive. And it's also in that spirit that I'm sharing these developments to a very diverse and global audience to raise awareness of these tools that have been yielding results. Now, at the end of the day, I do think it's important to remember these tools are just that. They are tools. And it's the role of us as a civil society organization to hold leaders to account and to make sure that the commitments they've made are actually being put in place. And I very much look forward to continue that work here in Brussels and across the organization.
Well, Alina, I know you played an important role in all of this and bringing, as you do, B'nai B'rith to the table in these discussions, and reference Katharina von Schnurbein, of course, who for a long time really was kind of out there alone. And by dint of her important work, other important developments have occurred, as you've said, including some of these programs now where Europe has taken on some very important challenges relating to addressing hate speech and disinformation online. And we know you played an important role in that as well. We thank you for all the work that you do in Brussels. We wish you well, and thank you for being with us today.
Thank you very much.